Bridget went missing first. The morning was bright, oblivious of the impending doom. Helene and I met at the bow after exiting our berths that morning. It was the third day of our vacation. We planned to make a cruise through the ocean for 3 days and return home after that. We smiled brightly at the sun, waiting for Bridget to join us. 10, 20, and 30 minutes passed, and we caught not a whiff of Bridget. At first, we thought it was because of the mini fight we had the night before. Bridget and Helene had a quarrel about the choice of dinner, and at the end of it, she went off to sleep, angry. Helene and I didn't eat either, and soon we went off to sleep too. We had planned to meet at the bow every morning since the beginning of the vacation cruise. When we didn't see Bridget after the first hour, our anger dissipated into worry. We started a frantic search of the yacht, trying to make sense of the nonsense that was happening around us. But there was no sign of Bridget. Not in the berths or conveniences, not with the crew. She was nowhere, and it made no sense. Helene and I sat down, worried after looking through the yacht for close to an hour. We went through her room and bed space, through the box of her belongings. It was still on the yacht. We asked the crew, but no one seemed to know anything of her whereabouts. We were in the middle of the sea with no explanation of where our friend had disappeared. "It's your fault!" I expected Helene to say it, even before she did. We were back at the bow, heads buried in our hands, terribly wishing that we were playing a complicated form of hide-and-seek. It was better than the reality that was seeming to be true. Bridget was mysteriously missing. I didn't respond to Helene's accusation, but she didn't stop either. "It was your idea for us to come to the middle of the sea. What do we do about Bridget? What if we don't find her after today? How do I explain this to everyone? Her parents? My parents? What are we supposed to say?" She stood and paced the floor, shooting accusing eyes at me every once in a while. She was right. It was my idea for the 3 of us to have a cruise in the middle of the sea as part of our summer vacation. We were drifting apart, my friends and I. Or they were drifting away from me. Bridget joined our class last semester, and she was friends with me first. She was a jovial lady, with a bright smile between her chubby cheeks. Her blonde twisted hair was one of a kind, and it was almost impossible for me to find a fault in her. Almost impossible. Helene had been my best friend forever. Our parents ran the same company, and we were always in each other's houses, one way or the other. When I took a liking to Bridget, I brought her to Helene, and that was where the problem started. Bridget had a way of stealing hearts, and I saw it. I saw her stealing away the heart of my best friend. I saw her draw Helene far away from me, further than I could ever imagine was possible. They hung out together and totally forgot about me. They went shopping. Helene replaced me with her, and I didn't like it. So when summer drew near, I suggested that the 3 of us take Helene's yacht for a cruise in the middle of the sea. That way, we could bond without any distractions or intrusion. The 2 of them were mesmerized by the idea. Helene, because she got the chance to spend time with both of her best friends, as she now referred to us, and Bridget because she'd never been on a yacht and couldn't imagine passing up the chance. I couldn't deny that I was glad when the 2 of them fought the night before. Of course, I wanted to be friends with both of them, not together but individually, each to myself. It didn't help if they wanted to be together. I was glad when Bridget excused herself and disappeared to her room. I thought Helene and I would have time together, but I was annoyed when she felt bad and decided to go to bed instead. I didn't have a choice but to go in too. "What will you do?" Helene's teary voice drew me out of my thoughts. I shrugged. I didn't know what to say. "You know what? I'll tell the crew to turn back now and take us back to shore. We need to find Bridget." She turned away and I watched her go. A couple of minutes later, the yacht changed direction and headed back home. I hated the direction our vacation was headed. 2 hours later, there was a terrible storm and we had to stay in our berths. It was late in the evening before the storm was over and I returned to the bow. The chef had prepared dinner. I told him to get Helene, assuming that she was angry and that's why she hadn't shown up yet. When the chef came back, his eyes were filled with horror, and I knew the news even before he told me. Helene was missing. Another frantic search began. Of course, what was the sense of two people missing in the middle of a sea? There were no traces of blood or struggle. They were just gone. The crew increased their speed, and by dawn we were back at shore. There, 2 human bodies and some detectives awaited me. Before I could say a word, handcuffs clipped my wrists, and I was dragged away from the yacht. I would have forever wondered how they figured out that I pushed Bridget and Helene over the edge. But the mystery was solved during the interrogation when a video of all I did to both my friends, betrayers, on the sea was played. How could I have known that there was a secret CCTV camera somewhere around the bow or in the berths? I was too foolish to remember that Helene's parents were rich enough to install them and watch as I lured Bridget from her room after the argument with Helene. How I led her to the bow in a pretense of trying to appease her. How I pushed her over the edge and smiled with adoration at my accomplishment. It was supposed to be a clean crime. That same camera watched me push Helene too during the storm. I didn't intend to, but she acted too quickly about Bridget and I didn't like it. The crazy storm pushed both bodies to the shore right before the yacht arrived. The detectives were notified by the crew, who had watched the playback after the storm. They sent the video to the detectives, who arrived in time to see the bodies and wait for the yacht. Bridget and Helene deserved it for wanting to replace me with one another. I should have been their only friend.
My ashes. Take them to the most northern region of my homeland, the Isle of Man. Bury them. Protect them. Goodbye, Felix. January 1994, Tuesday at 12 p.m. That was the exact year, month, date, and time my mom passed from cancer. She had been fighting it for over 4 years, with multiple cases of her verging on death, but never breaking the boundary. She was the only person who had ever cared for me after Dad died when I was still in the womb. And now she was gone, and nothing left but an urn filled with her ashes. After years and years devoted to raising me, nurturing me into an adult, I felt a duty to my mom to deliver her final wish, to be buried on the Isle of Man. The request seemed rather strange to me, as I had no recollection of why she would want her ashes left to rest there, but that was her wish, and I was going to see it through. I left early a couple weeks after she passed on a ferry that took me there in just a few hours. The trip was serene and calm. It felt as if nature guided my way to her grave. If only. I stepped onto the port of the northern territory of the Isle, where the coastal village sat, overlooking the great expanse of water disconnecting it from mainland Britain. It took around 15 minutes for me to reach the peak of the hill, looking down upon the village. I thought that this would suit her, a resting place high above the world, reaching out its hands to the heavens where I knew she was watching me from. I missed her, and tears rolled down my cheeks unstoppably as I dug her grave. In moments, I had created a gap in the ground to store her remains, or rather preserve them for God's judgment, as I said my final goodbyes and walked towards the village to find somewhere to stay. The village was extremely quiet, with the only lit window being that of a local inn where I found a warm bed to rest in, for a rather unique price, if anything. Breaking away from the expensive hotels back in Portsmouth, the town I lived in at the time. As I lay in bed, I drifted off into a false reality of conscience that tricked my mind into thinking about the day that had passed. Looking back on the burial procedure, it was indeed odd that so many from the village had been stopping and gasping at the sight of me tearing a hole into some random hill that lay beside them. Yet, as I walked into the village, not a single head turned. How peculiar, I thought. These recent memories soon faded from my mind, and eventually I was submerged in sleep, and my mind found a new reality to live in for the short time I had escaped mine for. I woke abruptly the next morning to a loud bang. Someone had slammed my door. I sprung out of bed and sprinted over to it, flung it open to see a man, likely to be the one responsible, running down the hallway, down the stairs. Luckily, I had slept in my day clothes, and it took me mere moments to shove my feet into my shoes and trail the sicko to find out what he was doing in my room while I was asleep. I ran downstairs with haste, only to see him escape through the lobby door. I called for someone to stop him, but it must have been quite early in the morning, as there wasn't a single soul sitting on the sofas nor behind the counter. I took it upon myself to catch him, and I followed him through the door and out onto the street. The sun beamed its agonizing rays into my eyes as I exited the inn, exposing me to the fact that it was more along the lines of midday. This was strange to me. I'd never woken up later than 8, even on the weekends. How on earth did I sleep until midday? I soon disregarded this thought as I saw the white outline of the same man sprinting into the doors of what appeared to be the village hall. Was he trying to hide from me? I swiftly made my way into that same building and carefully pushed open the doors, opening it up to a room filled to the brim with what seemed like the whole town dressed in white and blue cloaks. I froze in abject terror, and before I could close the doors to escape, I was dragged into the middle of the room by some men and was sent to my knees in front of a woman dressed in a quilted amethyst fabric, with her hood covering her eyes. But holding in her hands was none other than my mom's urn, covered in dirt. "What is this?" I yelled. "Do not speak. Now, open your ears. You have so much to hear." She spoke in a low, tenured vocal and was instantly enthralled to perk my ears to her words. "Felix, you have finally been caught. We never intended for you to hear this, but the time has come. Years ago, when you were still in your mother's womb, she snapped one day. It was at our local school where she was teaching a class when something in her head broke down. She rampaged the entire room. Though all the children escaped, when your father came to see what was wrong, she drove a chair leg through his skull and smiled. We recognized her mental state was zombified in nature by the cancer, so we chose to banish her instead of doing this, which we should have done so long ago. This is what killers deserve, Felix. We do, however, recognize that you did not play a part in her evil, so we will let you leave. But let this be a warning to you, Felix. Never return." And with that, I was allowed to leave. My mind couldn't even fathom what had just happened. I used my lighter to give myself a cigarette as I locked the doors to the village hall behind me, using a plank of wood nearby. They were lying. My mom could never have done that. I then started to hold my lighter under the wooden planks lining the exterior to the building. They just destroyed my mom's final wish. How could they? The flames soon caught the wood, and in moments, the entire building was set ablaze. And if they wanted to treat some poor cancer patient's ashes with such brutal disrespect and lies, then they shall become ashes themselves. I watched as the building was finally engulfed in flames. Black plumes of smoke bellowed into the sky above, with screams echoing the void of shadow. They would all pay. Mom would be so proud.
The worst of nightmares can be forged from the most simple of dreams. One moment you're just a normal girl going on a vacation with her friend, and the next moment you're caught in a murder. My feet brushed against the leaf of the bushes as I made my way through the mountainous terrain. I could hear laughter coming from behind me as we were our way through the trail. "Okay, I'm pretty sure that we're lost," I called out as I turned around to face Abby. It was getting dark and the sun was already starting to set. "No, I told you we're going on our own turf. I can't stand seeing the Alps with Joey the tour guide anymore, she said with a huff as she came to stand beside me. Abby and I were on a vacation to celebrate our finally finishing college. It was her idea for us to go to the Alps because it was on her bucket list. We had never been there before, but she seemed obsessed with the water springs that were located on the side of the mountain. Our guard had warned us initially against going there because the locals weren't very welcoming towards tourists, but Abby didn't care. She was always very strong-headed like that, and she preferred to do her own thing. Well, as long as you don't get us killed, I muttered under my breath. She didn't bother to respond as we continued making our way down the trail. We had long lost sight of the rest of the group, and although I wondered where they had gone off to, I was more focused on making sure that Abby didn't get us into trouble. It was getting dark, and we hadn't found the springs, and neither had we brought any torchlight with us. I shook my head as I realized that I couldn't do this anymore. I grabbed a hold of Abby's hand as I stopped her in her tracks. "We should head back. I can't do this anymore," I said to her. She scoffed, rolling her eyes at me as she made her way deeper into the forest. I groaned, knowing that I had to follow behind her now. "Stop it!" I hissed, but she didn't listen. "Stop worrying about everything. It's gonna be fine," she stated as she backed up against a tree. She didn't get to finish her sentence as a net shot out of the ground and encased her in it. She let out a scream, and I widened my eyes as I made my way over. She began to struggle as she hung several feet off the ground. I'm gonna get you out," I said as I reached out to tug on the rope. As I pulled on the rope that was attached to the tree, I felt something encase around me, and before I could react, I was also suspended in the air. I let out a loud scream as I found myself encased in the net just like Abby. We were stuck. I tried calling out for help multiple times, but it didn't work as no one seemed to be listening. After several hours, I heard the sound of leaves crunching as a figure in a loincloth and white face paint appeared in front of us. I opened my mouth to scream once more and watched as he pulled out a blow dart shooter and fired one right at my forehead. I felt my heart race as black dots covered my vision, and as he fired the second shot, I passed out. I woke up to the sounds of loud screams coming from all around me. The warmth of the fire was hot against my skin as I had a pounding headache. I groaned loudly as I pulled my eyes open and gasped in shock at the sight around me. I was in a bamboo cage, and I heard a loud chanting coming in front of me. Several men and women danced around the bonfire. I looked around me frantically and took notice of Abby's unconscious body in the corner. I crawled over to her and shook her body slightly. I gasped when I noticed that her neck had been slit open. My eyes watered as I choked back a sob at the realization that she was dead. "We must bring one man and woman for the ritual. The man first!" I heard a voice call out as I scurried the corner of the cage. I heard loud screaming once more, and then watched the men break off from the bonfire. One of the men had a large bone going through his nose. He turned to look at me with a smirk. I heard shuffling beside my cell, and watched as a man wearing cargo shorts was dragged out of the cell. I took notice of a stone slab beside the bonfire, and watched frozen in my spot as the man was lifted onto it and tied down onto the slab. He struggled as I watched them pull out a cloth and stuff it into his mouth in order to silence his cries. The man that had stared at me earlier, who I assumed was the chief, made his way over and pulled out a blade. Climbed on top of the captive, and I watched as he slit his wrists open. The blood splattered on the ground as I heard the people chant loudly. There were men banging their drums in the corner as the women cheered in celebration. The chief lifted the blade once more into the air as he stabbed the man in the chest. The man continued to struggle as the chief raised the blade into the air one last time before saying, "A sacrifice for the gods!" He then slit the man's throat open as he ended his life. I watched with a numb feeling as the body was removed from the altar and thrown into the bonfire. They muttered words in a strange tongue before turning their attention towards me. I pressed my body against the back of the cell, but it was of no use as it was pulled open and 2 men came inside and dragged me out. All eyes were on me in the dimly lit clearing as I was led toward the slab. I struggled in their hold, screaming frantically as tears streamed down my cheeks. They were much stronger than me as they tied me down onto the slab. They began to hum lowly as someone placed a dirty cloth in my mouth. It tasted like blood. I heard footsteps approaching me as the chief came over to the slab and climbed on top of my abdomen. I stared into his soulless eyes as he lifted up the same bloody dagger and slit my wrists with it. I cried out in pain, but it was muffled by the cloth, and watched as he pulled it out before stabbing my chest, causing my body to lurch. He raised the blade one last time as he said, "A sacrifice for the gods." Just as he pressed the blade to my neck, I felt something come over my body as I grabbed a hold of it. I looked up at him with hate-filled eyes before plunging the knife into his neck. I watched as he gurgled and blood splattered on my face. He convulsed for a moment before collapsing on top of me. "A sacrifice for the gods," I said hoarsely.